What we're going to do today is look at a project where we're going to make Nostepinnes. Nostepinnes are to knitters as clamps are to woodworkers. The more of them you have, the better. I started out with a block of mahogany that was 2 inches square roughly, maybe an inch and a half. I don't remember. I didn't check it because I knew I was going to take it down quite a bit from where it started. Here I'm using a roughing gouge to basically bring it into round. It was a little bit off center, so it took a little while to get rid of all the flat spots. Generally with a roughing gouge, you want to set the bevel on the wood and then drop your handle and start cutting. The nice thing about the roughing gouge is that you can tilt it at different angles. You can work from left to right, right to left. It's usually good to start in the middle and work out. Once you get it round, it's a little easier to kind of move back and forth across the whole workpiece. You can even work with it with the flute facing straight up and get some scraping going and even get a fairly smooth surface. Now the Nostepinne is a functional item, it's a utility piece, and so we're not worried too much about what it looks like, but the shape is important because this Nostepinne is used to make yarn balls, and so you want something that's easy to hold in your hand. So you'll see as we move forward on this that the one end of the Nostepinne will be relatively short and very round. The other end of the Nostepinne tapers to a fairly uniform diameter throughout its length, and it's a fairly short device. I call it a device, but a tool for knitters anyway. Here I'm using a carbide tip scraper to work a little bit closer to the chuck and get the piece smoothed out in that area. See, I've still got a flat spot there that I've got to work out. It happens to be on the end that's going to be tapered, so I can take quite a bit more wood off there if I need to, and it won't affect the outcome. We've turned down the noise on this video of the actual turning. I know one thing that drove my wife crazy when we first started watching YouTubes was that she just couldn't stand listening to all the wood turning, all the chips flying. I kind of like that, but I can understand, so we kept the sound to a minimum. One thing, though, that's interesting that I've seen, at least in the few years that I've been turning wood on the lathe, is that the sound that I hear is very important. It lets me know what's going on. I can tell if I get a little bit of a catch. I can tell a little bit about how well I'm cutting the wood, how the wood may be responding to the tool. So that auditory part of wood turning, I think, is pretty important. We talked a little bit about this at lathe safety, that when you're working on the lathe, sound is important, and you certainly want to protect your ears if it's going to be really noisy, but otherwise you need to have that extra information from turning the piece of wood that you get by hearing the tool working the wood. Okay, I've got it turned down relatively round here. This was one of the Nostepinnes that I made earlier when we didn't have the camera working very well. And I'm marking out the length of the handle. And then there's a little groove that we're going to cut there. And my wife will talk a little bit more about that later when she demonstrates the use of the Nostepinne. So now I'm going to be working down the shape. I've gone to a smaller spindle roughing gouge, get a little better control. And I'm going to start taking off some wood now to get this shape. I could actually have started out with another tool, maybe a Badan or something. I could have gotten a lot of this wood off in a hurry. but I enjoyed the turning. You know, I like the turning, and so I'm not in a big hurry here. Uh, I like to see those wood chips coming off. Also, it was a nice day today here in Florida. It was in the high 50s, and so I was outside with my lathe. I like to take my lathe outside whenever I can to work because the it's just a nice crisp winter day here in Florida, and it allows me also to keep the chips outside the shop, and I can use a leaf blower to get rid of them if I need to as they collect on the driveway. I apologize for the length of the video here, but uh, you know, we basically have concentrated most of our effort on writing our blog, and the video has just sort of been an extra addition to what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to get a lot of information out there, and you know, we're gonna continue to work on our videos, get a little better editing equipment, and try to do a little better job with that, because evidently a lot of people like to watch the videos, and so if we can supplement our written blog with these videos, it'll help us accomplish our goals. Generally, a Nostepinne is about anywhere from 9 to 12 inches long. The diameter of the part of the Nostepinne that's used to roll the ball of yarn is about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. If you look at some of the references we have on our blog, you'll see that uh, Nostepinnes have been very ornate over the years. They were, you know, considered to be almost an heirloom type item for some of these people that worked with yarn. And so it was very important to them to have something that looked nice as well as function. So later on, we did add a little ornamentation to these Nostepinnes just to dress them up a little bit. But the main emphasis was on form, or excuse me, on function and not on form. Here I'm using a round carbide tipped tool to try to smooth out this part of the Nostepinne a little better. And actually, I think I was having better luck with the roughing gouge than I was with this little round nose scraper. It was leaving a few ripples on there. Now I've got a pointed carbide tool that I'm using to define the groove at the base of the working part of the Nostepinne, and then also back at the end of the handle. I'm trying to round that off a little bit to get ready to cut that off with a parting tool later. And yes, I know if you look back there in the picture, you won't see any snow. Uh, we don't get that here in Florida, not very often. And I've got some sandpaper. I've turned the speed down. I'm using about 180 grit sandpaper here to kind of shape the Nostepinne a little bit, as well as to smooth out some of the tool marks. We don't have to get the Nostepinne to the point that it has a mirror finish. It actually helps if it's a little bit rough in terms of helping the knitter get the yarn to follow the contour of the Nostepinne. I'm sanding here with the grain, taking out some of the swirly marks left by the sandpaper when it was spinning. reason you're not seeing anything happening here is that I'm back picking out some additional tools that I need to basically part off the Nostepinne, and also preparing some of the finish that I'm going to apply to it. Normally I don't move the tool rest with the work spinning, but in this case I did. That's not a good idea. I wouldn't recommend that, but I was being pretty careful here. I'm using a parting tool to kind of get this down almost to the point where it's about, maybe a ½ inch left. Then I've got the pointed carbide tool that I'm using to kind of dress up that back end of the Nostepinne. Okay, we're going to basically slow things down a little bit, do a little bit more sanding here. I think I might have worked up to about 220 grit with this, but I didn't use really fine sandpaper. As I said, we're not trying to get something that's a mirror finish here. I didn't mention this earlier, but I actually chucked up this square cross-sectional piece of wood in a scroll chuck directly, and then of course used a Lathe center at the other end. And here I'm just sanding off that tip of the Nostepinne. It left a little dent in it from the Lathe center, but that's no big deal. Again, we're concerned more about the function of this. Some of the Nostepinnes, they actually cut a little slot up in the tip to act as an anchor for some of the yarn, depending on how you wind it. Okay, now we're going to start looking at applying a finish. I'm using, I think it's Ron Brown's high gloss friction polish. And I'm just really slopping it on here. And after I get a good coating, I'm going to turn up the speed and get it nice and hot. I don't know if you noticed, but before I started this, I did put a piece of Scott towel on my lathe bed to keep all this finish from dripping on the ways of the lathe. Sometimes, and I haven't been real careful about doing this, and it has created a real problem having to go back and clean up those ways and get all the gunk off of them so that my banjo will slide easily back and forth. Putting on a little bit more friction polish. I just put 2 coats on this, just enough to kind of protect the wood. And again, turn up the speed and heat up this friction polish. And that's it in terms of the finish there. So now we just need to part off the project. I'm using a thin parting tool here. I think this was a Sorby parting tool. It's really works well. Doesn't leave much of a nib on the end of the project. I'm kind of off camera here, but I'm getting a little bit of sandpaper and I'm sanding off that into the Nostepinne. You'll see a little bit more of that in a minute here. And then when I get through sanding that, I just take some of the friction polish and work it into the end grain, just again to give it a little bit of protection. Now here I've taken the Nostepinnes and gone to the laser engraver, and you can see here that I'm lasing a Norse symbol, and it's called the Web of Weird, I think it is, W-Y-D, and you can read a little bit more about that in our blog, what this symbol means. Here are the two Nostepinnes that we made with the laser, and then here is this is the Swift, and Jennifer's going to demonstrate how this is used in just a second.
Okay, so I'm going to tie the end of the yarn around this nice little bead here in the Nostepinne, so it'll anchor it, okay? And then I'm just going to take the yarn and start winding it, and I'm going to wind it in this direction and then this direction. Okay. This is to get it started. Okay. And I can tell this is fresh from the laser because you can smell the burnt wood on it. Okay, I've got a knot here. Okay, stop. Just winding the yarn still.
Now, which end of the yarn do you pull? The one that's around the handle? Is that the one that's going to come out the center?
Yes, I believe so.
I had a lot of confidence in that answer there. Sort of makes sense that it would.
Some people buy a ball winder, electronic thing, and they go ahead and wind up their yarn that way. Take it off the hank like this and wind it with a ball winder, but I find this to be very relaxing to do this.
Well, you showed me some yarn earlier that you were using to make a hat that evidently had already been wound so that it was a center pull. So not all yarn that you buy comes in the center pull configuration, huh?
True. I think that at one time, the yarn that I would buy from the big box store would all be wound that way so that you could pull it right out of the center and would never get tangled up, which was great. But a lot of these specialty yarns, these homegrown yarns that you buy are not wound, and they offer to wind them for you in the yarn store. But it's more work for them.
Now I noticed that in looking at pictures of these Nostepinnes on the web that most of them are pretty short. Um, so why? I know you've got one that basically is like a spurtle that you turn that you're used for a Nostepinne, but what's the advantage of the short over the long?
Well, I like one that'll fit in my hand. Okay, so now I've gotten this started. So you're going to go ahead and wind it by wrapping the yarn from bottom to top around this little area that's already been started as you're turning it.
So you want something that like almost like a ball-shaped handle that can turn easily in your hand, and you want it short enough that you can get over the end of it like you're doing without having to reach a mile out in space to do it.
Right, with with the long spurtle. I mean, I use I've used the spurtle when I couldn't find the Nostepinne or when the Nostepinne had yarn on it or something, so that I just kind of make a ball at the end of it
Now, when you
because
get through doing this, you can actually take it off the Nostepinne though, right? You don't have to
right,
leave it on.
you can take it off the Nostepinne and it'll be in its nice little compressed little ball, and I guess depending on how experienced you are at this, your center pull ball is going to look, looser or more compact. I've got a friend who, when she winds hers, she makes a nice little square ball out of it, and it's just really nice looking. Mine,
Wow.
mine are always more oval shaped, and then I've known people that make a nice perfectly round one. So
Well, we'll turn off the video now because this is sort of like watching woodworkers sand wood, and we'll
except for
come
the
back.
soundtrack.
We'll come back when you're done.